Most of you know that my wife and I and our son Micah live together in our community house here in the west end of Winnipeg. And the west end of Winnipeg is what might be called an inner city neighborhood. Um, for some, that's a scary term that means gangs and violence and drugs. And while those dynamics are present, for us it means we live in the heart of the city with some of the most wonderful diversity and community and beauty that you don't necessarily get uh, in other places. Um, but as I was considering this the other day, that I'm raising my son in this, which I have no problem with, I did realize how different his childhood is from mine. My son is a masterful navigator. At 6 years old, he knows how to get around the city. He remembers streets and directions and where people live. It's remarkable. Um, but I didn't grow up in that setting. I actually grew up in northwestern Ontario, 10 miles from the nearest town, which was 1,000 people, and that town was Rainy River, Ontario. And I lived in the bush, and our home was on the banks of the very beautiful and broad Rainy River. Um, yeah, and living there with all the beauty, and here's a picture of our front yard. That you can see my brother and I and a friend on the dock in front of our house in this picture. Um, and so living out there, we had all sorts of wonderful experiences and encounters that for me were neat, but were normal. But when I tell these stories to my son, they are just magical to him. Like, he loves hearing the story about the time I was home alone as a teenager, and it was nighttime, and I was in the basement watching TV, and I heard some noise outside, and I figured it was my parents' home. And so I stood up from the couch. The lights were off, so I could see out in the dark, and it was dark. Like, I mean, it's not like the city; it's dark, dark. And I stood up and looked out the window. My face was right up against the glass, and there, with its nose pressed against the glass, was a black bear. And no matter how familiar you might be with living with black bears around, that's a startling experience. And I fell backwards and screamed and tripped over the coffee table and landed on my back. And the only thing that spared my dignity in that event was the fact that A, there was no one there to see it, and B, the bear was equally startled and grunted and stumbled backwards and ran off into the darkness. Now, that would have been a funny story if it stayed like that, but I was a stupid teenager, not like this cute little child pictured here. Nope, nope. I was this teenager. And as some teenagers are prone to do, I had something to prove. I wasn't going to be scared of no bear. And so one night, again, I was home alone. It's pitch black. I grabbed a flashlight, didn't turn it on, and I walked out into our yard. And we had a big backyard. And I walked to the far end of the yard because I'd heard something outside, probably a bear. And I didn't turn on the flashlight until I got to the far end of the yard. I turned around and faced the house and turned on the flashlight because I wasn't going to, be scared of a bear. Now, I'm lucky I wasn't attacked or something. I mean, they're not too ferocious if they're left alone, but it was foolish. But to Micah, hearing the story, it's just remarkable, and things like getting in a canoe after school and going for a canoe ride as though it was as common as him getting home and going for a bike ride. Me living beside water was as natural as it could be. For Micah, water is something you have to travel to, with the exception of times like this, pictured here, our street being flooded in the rains. But aside from that, these stories are remarkable to him, and it gives me a perspective of how my experience shaped me living in the country and yet living here in the city, and I wonder what the impact of him being raised in the city will mean for his future. Anyway, I like to tell these stories because they're fond memories, and so maybe in future videos I'll tell more stories, like the times I had brown bats that rode on my shoulders, very cute, or the time that I was cross-country skiing and came across a couple of timber wolves, which are not like dogs, they're like small horses. These things are huge. And other such stories. So if you're interested, let me know. In the meantime, peace and all good.